I've gotten requests to look at this video, another video from the channel Second Thought, a channel that I have rebutted multiple times. I made a parody video back in December called I Am Having Second Thoughts on Capitalism. So I recommend checking that out if you haven't. But this one's about American education. Let's see what Second Thought has to say about American education.
This episode is made possible by CuriosityStream. Get free access to Nebula, the streaming platform built by all your favorite YouTubers, when you sign up for CuriosityStream with the link below.
Now, notice how this starts right off the bat, 8 seconds in. Notice that this Marxist, and this is not hyperbole, Second Thought, this is a Marxist socialist propaganda channel, that's what I would call it. Some may consider it an educational channel, including myself, although I would say it's a pretty bad educational channel. But notice how it starts with an advertisement from CuriosityStream, which for those who don't know, they are kind of like a Netflix for documentaries. I would say documentaries, while they should all be taken with a grain of salt, they are educational material. Looking at their website, you can get a membership for a low cost of $3 a month and watch all of these documentaries, all these wonderful educational documentaries on CuriosityStream, which is a sponsor of the educational channel Second Thought, which if you look into this guy's Patreon, where is it? This guy has about 1,900 patrons, so he's making at least $3,600 a month. He probably gets more than $2 on a lot of these patrons before taxes and fees. What's my point here? Just keep all of this in mind.
In the United States, we like to pride ourselves on being the best at things. We spend more
yeah.
money than any other nation on our military, healthcare, and education. Unfortunately,
And that's true. I believe that depending on which source you read it, from what I've seen, America does spend more on military, education, and healthcare.
simply throwing money at things doesn't make you the best at them.
And simply throwing money at things doesn't make you the best at them. There's a lot of truth in that as well. Keep that in mind.
Our military, despite having the budget of the next 10 biggest spenders combined, is tremendously wasteful and is constantly used as a destabilizing force in regions we wish to dominate or exploit.
And this is a thing that Second Thought does. He often kind of mentions something as a little tangent that's such bullshit that I want to get into it, but it would take me 5 minutes to address it. But I would say I love the fact that America has a more powerful military than the next 10 countries combined, and I would like to keep it that way, although I am willing to have a discussion on the fact that a lot of spending on military is probably wasteful and that we probably are involved in places we should not be. But again, as Second Thought would say, that's a discussion for another day.
Our healthcare system, despite occupying the world's #1 spot for per capita expenditure, is routinely ranked the worst in the developed world in terms of access, efficiency, and effectiveness.
Not sure about access. Of course, he probably means like, you got to pay for service in the United States. But as we know, in a lot of these socialized medical systems, wait times are a lot worse. I saw a tweet a few days ago about this guy who got in Canada. We're always hearing how wonderful the Canadian healthcare system is. Meanwhile, they're way behind the United States right now on vaccinations for COVID. And I saw someone tweet it out. I guess we should take it with a grain of salt. They tweeted out a letter that they got from a doctor in Canada saying that they would have to wait 4.5 years for a certain treatment. So, are we really the worst in terms of access? Now, this is another tangent video. This is another tangent point, I should say, that would take a lot of discussion. And America's healthcare system does suck. And I've talked about this, particularly in my video response to John Oliver's segment on Medicare for All. And I think all of the problems with American healthcare, from healthcare to drugs to health insurance, are a consequence of government intervention in healthcare.
You're goddamn right.
While each of these topics deserves its own video, in this episode we're going to focus on the US education system, why it's failing our students and teachers, and what we can do to fix it. Think back to your time in school.
And yeah, there are a lot of problems with America's education system. But let's hear what a second thought thinks the problems are.
School. What do you remember? Early mornings, long windowless hallways punctuated by locked doors, a strictly regimented schedule. Your school life was dictated by the authority of the teacher, who conditioned you with countless commands every day. Sit down, open your textbook to page 10, stop talking, line up.
I mean, it is the teacher's job to teach and educate and get the kids excited about learning.
You were punished for speaking to classmates, making a joke, or coming in a single minute late. You had to get permission to use the restroom. Class started with a bell and ended with a bell. There's another kind of institution that follows a similar structure. It shouldn't come as a surprise that in the US, many of the same architects who designed our prisons also designed our schools.
Is that true? The architects of America's prisons designed the schools? Now, this is another point. I think the father, the biggest influence on American public education is John Dewey, the father of progressive education, who has had a profound influence on education, including private schools, by the way. And I think this is a reason why European and other non-American schools have performed better than the United States, is because John Dewey has not really had an influence outside of America. And I did a whole video on John Dewey. It's called "The Kids Aren't Thinking," where I bring in a lot of receipts. I cite a lot of books.
Read a book, read a book, read a motherfucking book. Read a book, read a book, read a motherfucking book.
As you can see here, Dewey says the mere absorbing of facts and truths is so exclusively individual and affair that it tends to very naturally pass into selfishness. Oh no. There is no obvious social motive for the acquirement of mere learning. There is no clear social gain in success thereat. And I brought in a lot of receipts. Dewey, he was very anti-conceptual in his approach to education. He once said that Aristotle's logic, having worked well for so long, is overdue for a change. And a lot of Dewey's predecessors in this field have become even more anti-conceptual as years have gone on. But again, it took me 22 minutes to address that, so I recommend checking that out in a different video. But no, I don't think it was America's prison architects that designed America's educational system.
For many of us, school is an unpleasant memory. Sure, most of us had fun with friends we made in class, but that fun was exclusively outside of school hours. Odds are the memory of your education itself is pretty negative. Besides the experience of attending American school, the outcomes the system produces are also less than stellar.
Yeah, true.
Despite our culture.
Now, why is that? What's wrong with America's educational system, according to Second Thought? Again, this video has 250,000 views. It's a channel that has over 1 million subscribers.
Obsession with getting American students to perform well in standardized testing, our scores fall squarely in the middle of the pack compared to other industrialized nations. This single-mindedness also has a more critical consequence. By demanding our teachers simply prepare students for testing rather than fostering an actually effective learning environment, we end up with students who not only forget everything they crammed into their heads immediately after taking the test, but who also lack the skills required to learn effectively. The students aren't the only ones suffering. The US has exceptionally high teacher turnover due to low pay and long hours.
Low pay and long hours for teachers.
And compounding the problem, a teacher shortage.
We have a teacher shortage as well, apparently.
So, to sum up the problem, our students are unhappy, perform poorly, and don't gain the critical skills they need. And our teachers are unhappy, overworked, and we don't have enough of them to meet a growing need. A country depends on its young people, those who will grow up and take the reins from the previous generations. So why are we failing them so badly? Before we get into some potential solutions, we need to understand the 3 main problems plaguing the American education system.
3 main problems. What are they?
These 3 problems are the system's outdatedness, its underfunding, and its privatization.
Underfunding and privatization, he lists as 2 of them. Underfunding and privatization.
You're a liar!
Now, in my video parody of Second Thought, I made a joke about how a lot of what this goof does is he just spews out empty bromides and slogans and left-wing talking points over some fancy stock footage. He doesn't really back it up. He said, what did he say? Underfunding and privatization?
Before we get into some potential solutions, we need to understand the 3 main problems plaguing the American education system. These 3 problems are the system's outdatedness, its underfunding, and its privatization.
Privatization. And he also mentioned that teachers are underpaid, not paid well. So let's look at some facts. This is according to the National Center for Education Statistics. By the way, I've actually talked about this before in other videos. Remember when he said earlier in this video that merely throwing money at a problem won't magically make it better? I talked about this before, about how some of the worst failing school districts in America, school districts like Detroit, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Milwaukee, and a lot of other cities that have been run by Democrats for well over a half century. A lot of these schools spend way more than the national average per student per year on education, and they have the worst performing schools. But if you look at some of the national statistics, this is part of the Department of Education, the National Center for Education Statistics. As you can see right here, current expenditures per pupil enrolled in the fall in public elementary and secondary schools were 20% higher in 2017 than they were in 2001, which was $12,800 roughly, versus $10,700, both in constant 2019 dollars. So this is inflation adjusted, it looks like. Current expenditures per pupil increased from $10,700 in 2001 to $12,400 in 2009, decreased a little bit, and you can kind of see this on the chart. Even though the decrease was still higher than it was in 2001, it was at $11,800, and then increased again to $12,800 in 2017. So we've been spending more money. Education spending from local to state to federal spending has just gone nowhere but up the last half century. But even if we look at the last 20 years, it's still going up. And then according to this report from the census, the United States invested more than $694 billion on elementary and secondary public school in 2017. It was the largest yearly total expenditure increase since 2008. And according to this, school systems are spending more on teachers. Instructional salaries was the largest overall expenditure category, $230 billion in 2017, accounting for 33% of total spending. And then I had some other sources. This is a Forbes article showing the evolution of teacher salaries since 2002. Varies depending on the state. As you can see, it looks like it's been going up, increasing the last 15 to 20 years. This report by the Rockefeller Institute of Government, as you can see right here, teacher salaries have been going nowhere but up since 2002, 2003 in every state. So the schools are not underfunded. We keep giving them more and more money. It looks like teacher salaries have been increasing. I know this can get more complicated because different districts, different states and whatnot do things differently. It's probably different depending on what subject you teach, what your educational level is, bachelor's versus master's, how much tenure you have. I know a lot of those factors go into it, but if you just look at these numbers, it looks like the issue is not teacher salaries or underfunding. But then he also mentions privatization. Apparently, as he's going to talk about, private schools are just taking over. But if you look at, again, the Department of Education, private school enrollment has been low for 20 years. It was 6 million in 1999 and it has actually decreased a little bit. Private enrollment looks like it went from 6 million in the fall of 1999 to 5.7 million in 2017. And it was enrollment was 11% of the total enrollment in 1999, and now it is down to 10%. So again, I don't know whether second thought here is being blatantly dishonest or he doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about, but either way, he's wrong.
No surprise there.
The lack of funding and the rapid privatization of the education system go hand in hand. So let's start there. When you think of the average school, whether
Rapid privatization, huh?
elementary, middle, or high school, you're generally thinking about a public institution. That is, a school that is federally funded and tasked with providing education to all people of the appropriate age in a given school district free of charge. Public schools have existed in the U.S. since before it officially became a country. But the first Board of Education was established in Massachusetts in the year 1837. The person spearheading the education initiative, Horace Mann, believed that public education was the best way to overcome poverty, bridge social gaps, and prepare young people to enter the workforce. The Federal Department of Education was established 30 years later.
I believe the Federal Department of Education, I know some sort of Department of Education existed in some form, but I think the modern one was established in the 1970s by Jimmy Carter. And again, no matter Democrat or Republican, spending has just gone nowhere but up. I believe George W. Bush tripled the Department of Education's budget during his presidency. So, Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter. Budget spending just go up and up and up.
The goal of standardizing and helping to implement education across the country. What may be surprising to some is that private schools actually predate public schools in the US. As early as the 1660s, individual teachers were offering their services to young people and...
So again, there are a lot of problems with modern American education, but privatization, underfunding, those are not problems.
Adults as a way to supplement their income. This private schooling often took place in the evenings, and was less structured than typical day school. By the beginning of the American Revolution, private schools had become pretty well established and were favored by those who could afford their fees. Fast forward to more modern times, and, like with healthcare and infrastructure, we begin to see a problem with accelerating privatization. The practice...
Accelerating privatization, enrollment in private schools has been declining, and it was already small.
Of privatization is simple. It entails the handing off of once public responsibilities to privately owned companies. Since the 80s, there's been a consensus, a deeply flawed one, but a consensus nonetheless.
A consensus, huh?
There's nothing the government can do that the private sector can't do better. The word better is doing some heavy lifting here. Private companies often get things done more quickly or with a greater profit, but what free market enthusiasts fail to realize is that the outcomes are incredibly damaging, as is the case with American healthcare, or extremely fragile, as evidenced by private infrastructure projects. Take the Texas power grid, for example. It's entirely deregulated. This allows them to cut...
You're a liar!
This is another thing I made a video about a few weeks ago, the Texas power crisis. And I mentioned Don Watkins and Alex Epstein. They've been talking about the Texas power grid and how vulnerable it has been. They were talking about it back in 2019, about how vulnerable it is. And I also demonstrated how, contrary to popular belief, that second thought is echoing here, the Texas power grid is far from deregulated. In fact, starting in the late 1990s, it was a Republican George W. Bush, hate to bring him up again, but he's the one who got the ball rolling on transitioning Texas from fossil fuels to wind energy. And over the last decade, instead of maintaining and upgrading the Texas power grid, which has been recommended by a variety of regulators, they've decided to spend more and more and more money on windmills while closing down and refusing to open more fossil fuel and nuclear-based power plants. And so, yeah, this notion that the Texas power grid is deregulated is a total lie.
Cost and make a greater profit. It also sets them up for disaster, as we saw with a recent winter storm that completely knocked out the state's power and left millions stranded in freezing conditions. Of course, a crisis like this is considered an acceptable risk when there's a nice profit to be had. This free market...
This guy's all mad about profits, not profits, you guys! Now imagine if we had more of a profit motive in education. Think about what happens. You know what a business has to do in order to turn a profit? They have to convince you to give up your money in exchange for their good or service. They have to convince you that you are better off without the money in your pocket and the money in your bank account in exchange for whatever they are offering. If you want a nice, reliable car that costs, say, $20,000, a motor company, an automobile company like Ford, Kia, Toyota, Dodge, whatever automobile company you got. I know a lot of people are really anal about their automobile companies. They have to convince you that your life is better off, that your life would be better off with their reliable, safe means of transportation, because just having $20,000 in cash it's not going to just help you get from point A to point B rather quickly. Same thing with education. If we had more profit motive, more privatization in education, schools would have a burden of proving to parents that their schools are really good at educating kids and teaching them how to think. And they'd probably show you around the school. They would probably have some statistics to show you, some graduation statistics, math proficiency statistics, reading comprehension statistics. Maybe they have a resume of notable alumni who have graduated and went on to become lawyers, CEOs, doctors, astronauts, engineers. Show you, how many graduates go on to prestigious universities and Ivy League, places like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown, University of Michigan, Notre Dame, Stanford, Georgia Tech, Florida, Florida State, Florida Atlantic, Miami, Florida, whatever is the prestigious university these days. And on top of that, if you send your kid to one of these schools and you decide that this school is not doing a good job of educating your kid, you can say, look, I'm not satisfied with my money, so I'm going to pull my kid out. And then the business has more of an incentive to bend over backwards, maybe change a few things, maybe appeal to your self-interest in order to keep you at their school. And if not, there's probably going to be a lot of competition, as Second Thought's going to mention toward the end of this video, and I kind of agree. Not all kids learn the same. Some kids are going to have different ways of learning. Some kids are going to learn better in some areas than others. Some kids are going to have different interests than others. And so it might be beneficial to have more competition in a free market. Whereas the modern education system, if you're not satisfied, the way it works today is you just send your kid to whatever school is closest in your neighborhood. And if you're not satisfied with the education he's getting, what are you going to do? You're going to say, I'm going to pull my kid out? They're going to get the money no matter what. Maybe they lose, per pupil. Maybe some districts do it, whereas they allocate money based on how many kids are in the school. But what are you going to do? Send them to another school in the same exact district that has the same approach, same curriculum? And then what's your recourse then? Are you going to wait for the next election, which could be 2 years away at least, and hope that some new people are going to run for the board of education? Hope that a mayor appeals to your self-interest and promises to bring reform to the local schools? You're going to hope that your neighbors vote up the taxes to raise funds that the schools need? By the time that happens, it might be 2 years, 3 years, 5 years later. Your kid has already lost valuable years of their life, valuable years of their childhood, valuable years of their youth that they're not getting back. But heaven forbid we have a profit motive in education.
Logic has slowly seeped into the realm of education. Over the past couple of decades, various federal initiatives have provided parents the option of using federal funds to send their children to private schools, whether by providing so-called school choice vouchers or allowing for the possibility of school transfers, where students can move from low-performing schools to higher-performing private schools.
From low-performing public schools to high-performing private schools. Why would how dare these parents try to get their kids into a better school?
This has led to a number of problems. The most obvious is that by spending federal money to incentivize parents to enroll their children in private school, they've robbed public schools of badly needed funding.
Well, if these public schools are failing, why keep giving them money in the first place?
Why spend money to move kids around when you could simply fund the schools that are designed to be funded by that money? Because of this...
Well, I thought funding wasn't the problem. I guess it is and it isn't. Throwing money at the problem won't magically make it better, but they're also underfunded, even though I just showed you that they're not.
Practice, public schools face a vicious cycle. There's not enough money to pay teachers, so teachers leave, which leads to more students.
Even though teachers apparently are getting paid more and more, public schools are investing more and more in paying teachers.
Students in each class, which overwhelms the remaining teachers. There's not enough money for school supplies or even basic school maintenance, which leads to unsafe learning environments. These problems compound over time, which makes the schools perform worse, which then suggests to the federal government that they're doing the right thing by incentivizing the move to private schools. Okay, but if the private schools perform better and the average parent can afford them, why not just abandon public schools? There are
why not?
Few reasons, some innate to how private schools operate and some based on the responsibility of the federal government.
Innate to how private schools operate.
First and foremost, it has been long established that the state has a responsibility to provide access to free education to every student.
Well, I know a lot of people operate on that premise, but that's a premise that needs to change. The state should only be responsible for protecting individual rights and property rights. I don't think that the state should be involved in educating kids, promoting ideas, teaching your kids what to think and how to think. And I think he mentioned at some point earlier, I think I might have missed it, that if we just had, without public schools, then a lot of poorer kids with that are born into poorer families, they might fall through the cracks and not get access to a decent education. Which I've been reading this book recently. I'm in the middle of it, called The Beautiful Tree by James Tooley. And it's about this intellectual who has been around the world, particularly in India and parts of Africa, poorer parts of the world. And he's discovered that in a lot of these countries, the public schools in these countries are mainly reserved for the children, for the politically connected rich in these countries. And there's not enough spots in these public schools. And there's been a growing trend of small private schools developing in these countries, particularly India. And the children who go to these schools are their parents are dirt poor. They don't make that much money, and they still place a high priority on their children's education and still find a way to get the money necessary to send their kids to these private schools. And James Tooley has found that a lot of these private schools operate better than the public schools, and they still turn a profit. Not to mention, I think in a free market, you would probably see a lot of charitable contributions especially from big philanthropists. I know we saw this from people like Carnegie back in the late 19th century. He was very generous with opening libraries and giving away money to scholarship funds, if I'm recalling correctly. And I think on top of that, you would probably still have a very microscopic portion of the population of parents who might not prioritize their kids' education. I think in cases like that, you could probably make a case that not trying to provide your kids with an adequate education is considered negligence, and that the state should be coercive in trying to get those parents to make an attempt to educate their kids. If not, then remove those kids from those households because the parents are clearly being negligent. But apparently, I guess the alternative is we got to use the coercive power of the state to bring the entire realm of education under the control of the state. What a wonderful idea.
This is non-negotiable, at least for now. If public schools didn't exist,
I agree, it's non-negotiable. The state should not be involved with educating kids.
Would be students who could not afford to go to private school. Since education is a right, this is
That's where he mentioned it. Education is a right. Do you have a right to other people's knowledge? Do you just have a right to the services of a teacher? Should we just enslave the teacher since we have a right to their services?
unacceptable.
No, we should just, rob everyone a little bit and then, hope the money finds its way to the teachers' bank accounts.
So, for the time being, the federal government cannot reasonably get rid of public schools entirely. The other issues stem from the private schools themselves. By their very nature, private schools are not beholden to any kind of governance when it comes to what is taught within their walls. All they have to do is provide proof that their education meets basic educational standards.
Again, they would have to appeal to your self-interest and demonstrate that they are good at educating kids. I think in a free market, intelligent people, would try to meet and fill this demand if there's money to be made. And I think there is, because I think rational people would want their kids to have at least a decent education, which I don't think they're getting in today's modern American public education system.
This has led to an upsurge in what can be considered reactionary, or as the schools prefer, traditional education. What this means in essence is that most private schools skew intensely religious, conservative, and insular. Now,
he actually makes a good point here. In fact, one of the sources, you guys are probably waiting for a gotcha. Like, one of those charts showed that a lot of it is religious based. And as you can see right here, I think half the public schools, it looks like, over half are some form of religious education. And this is a genuine concern, especially when talking about vouchers. I think vouchers can be a good step toward privatizing education, but I think a lot of people, I see a lot of libertarians and conservatives thinking that vouchers are the solution. And I think vouchers will actually create a lot of problems. I think if we were to switch to voucher systems, it might create a situation with modern college education where costs keep going up and up because the government is guaranteeing student loans, backing student loans, while more and more kids go to college, thereby driving up demand. And the universities, which are still controlled by the public, they know that they can continue jacking up prices because the loans are going to be backed by the government. If all those private schools in an area know that every parent is getting, say, $10,000 for each of their kid per year, why would they charge under $10,000? They're more likely to charge a little bit more. Now, that's yet to be seen, but I think a lot of today's voucher advocates need to be prepared for if and when that happens, because if it happens, a lot of opportunistic, shit-stained politicians will say, see, it's driving up costs, and these for-profit schools are pinching pennies out of these parents. Capitalism doesn't work. It doesn't work in the realm of education. Schools are way too important to leave to the free market. Let's get the government back involved. So it should be a transitionary step, maybe. It is not the solution. But going back to religious-based education, there is an issue of whether or not it's, one, constitutional, and two, right for the government to essentially subsidize churches through vouchers by letting parents give them to religious-based schools. And a lot of private schools today are very influenced by religion. Now, maybe if we had more of a free market, maybe we'd have more, maybe we'd have some secular alternatives of private education other than religious-based.
Their student body is overwhelmingly white, Christian, and wealthy. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with a parent wanting their child to get a religious education. But the problem is, in the US, Christianity has been co-opted by conservatism. Gone are the days when people understood Jesus to be a brown communist from the Middle East, who railed against the rich and preached inclusion, decency, and the value of living humbly. Most American Christians have grafted the language of conservatism onto their faith. Homophobia, racism, unfettered free market economics, and a rabid
Unfettered free market economics.
hatred for anything that could be considered even remotely socialist. This is not by accident. The political right has adopted religious
Yeah, and look at Tucker Carlson, Mr. Laissez-faire, huh?
patriotic language in an attempt to secure a large and dedicated voting bloc.
Also Trump, Mr. Laissez-faire. He's Mr. Unfettered, Unregulated Capitalism. Really?
Evangelicals, and it's worked. In modern private schools, and I should know, I attended one, it's not uncommon to see PragerU videos shown in class. It's not uncommon to see economics classes that espouse the suicidal free market ideology of Friedman and Rand.
The suicidal free market ideology. Meanwhile, this guy promotes Marxism. Really? But again, I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if private schools show Prager University videos and promote Milton Friedman or even Ayn Rand along with their religious garbage.
History classes portray the US as the good guy in every conflict, including those where we were clearly in the wrong. Today's supposedly Christian education would not be recognized as such by the Jesus of the Bible. Instead, it's a new religion, the religion of free market conservatism. It shouldn't come as a surprise.
Yeah, Mr. Trump, Donald Trump, Mr. President. He was Mr. Free Markets, right? Railing against the big tech companies. Woo! Going after all the big tech companies with antitrust, feuding with some of America's top businessmen like Boss Bezos and Charles Koch. He campaigned again on using import taxes as a punishment for companies that outsource. Was hostile to international trade throughout his presidency, and not just on China. Oh, well, we got to get to China. Well, then why was he threatening tariffs on European Union automobiles and Canada and Brazil? Huh? That's just for all the MAGAs who are going to, Trump, baby, we got to beat the left. Shut the fuck up.
Is that those in power are doing their best to get more students enrolled in private school. Indoctrinating them into the cult of capitalism while they're young is the only way they can produce more pro-corporate voters. Heck, judging by what we've seen recently, it wouldn't come as a surprise to see public schools go the same way. The previous administration even suggested the creation of a commission for patriotic education, a slate of pro-America, capitalist, imperialist propaganda.
Now, that is concerning. Again, I don't want, especially the federal government. I think if the federal government is to be involved with education, it should be, their only role should be to enforce Supreme Court decisions like Brown versus the Board of Education, Scopes, and whatnot. Because if we're going to have public education at the local and state level, I would like them to respect the Constitution and not segregate schools based on race or gender. But it is worth contextualizing that the patriotic curriculum that the Trump administration was pushing was in response to a lot of school districts promoting and inserting the 1619 Project, which is full of lies and bad premises and has been denounced by a variety of historians, including left-wing historians, the 1619 Project was starting to get crammed into public school curricula.
This disturbing trend towards private.
But the the solution isn't like, oh, well, we're getting the 1619 Project. We need to have like a pro-American. The solution ultimately is to get the government out of education and out of ideas completely.
And capitalist indoctrination aside, what's perhaps the bigger problem with American education is the fact that the entire system is simply outdated. Remember the Massachusetts School Board? The one established in 1837? Well, that's when the standards for education were established. The stated goal was to educate young people. But if you take a look at how school was and is structured, it becomes more clear what education was actually for. Like it is today, the school day was strictly regimented. Teachers expected absolute obedience. The bell instructed students when the day began and ended. And punishment was doled out for any perceived non-compliance. If the students retained some basic arithmetic, great. But the real goal was to produce obedient, servile workers for the factories of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, so that's why the schools were created, to shuffle kids into factories. Again, read John Dewey. That's not he wasn't trying to create schools just to create factory workers.
Step onto a factory floor and what's expected? Obedience, focus.
I mean, I believe people were working in the factories long before, public education really took off in the late 19th and early 20th century.
The ability to follow instructions for hours on end. The day even began and ended with a bell. School was then and remains today an instrument to instill discipline, to mass-produce agreeable little cogs for the industrial machine. The
that's what it is.
Standardization of schooling ensured these cogs were nice and uniform, easily replaceable and expendable. Today, nearly 2 centuries later, factory labor is no longer the prime driver of the economy. Companies still need workers, but they demand a new set of skills.
Especially in the 19th and early 20th century, a lot of, before the ubiquity of public education, a lot of parents could not afford to send their kids, provide their kids with an education, and that's why a lot of kids started working in factories, was because otherwise they'd be working on the farm.
Young people entering the workforce are expected to be able to be flexible, creative, and on call at unreasonable hours. Even from a capitalist perspective, modern-day schooling does not adequately prepare our students for the real world. Of course, preparing students for a lifetime of servitude should not be the goal of a good education. Let's examine the main issues in regards to outdatedness. Which of these two hypothetical classes sounds more applicable to real life, Latin or home economics? Guess which one is more commonly taught. If the goal of school is to prepare kids...
No, I actually agree. I think home economics, particularly cooking, should... I would like it to be taught more in schools, because not only is something like cooking a valuable life skill that I think a lot of people should have, but I think it's also a good way of teaching math and science, because a lot of cooking are technically chemical reactions when you really boil it down. And sometimes cooking involves, difficult math complexes like converting fractions and whatnot.
For the real world as we're meant to believe, we are doing our students a great disservice. Why don't we teach home economics classes? Why don't we teach high schoolers how to file taxes? What about useful things like basic first aid? We simply don't teach applicable skills. Then there's the fact that school curriculum just hasn't kept pace with advancements in modern technology. Basic computer classes are offered as electives, if at all. Even less common are video production, digital art, coding, web design, 3D modeling, and countless other modern skills. We're letting students down when we don't acquaint them with modern tools. As a personal anecdote, I have a younger sister who's shown a proclivity for drawing. Her school's art class, while led by a good teacher, doesn't even mention new digital techniques. Since I work creatively for a living, I took the liberty of teaching her a bit about digital art and apps like Procreate. Her skills have improved more in the last 2 months than in the previous 2 years. And I'm no artist. I just told her about the app and suggested she watch some YouTube videos.
He suggested that his sister watch YouTube videos to learn art. This goes back to what I said at the beginning. We have this, thanks to greedy corporations, large, greedy, big tech corporations. Woo! Like Google, we now have this wonderful service called YouTube, where there is now a market in providing educational content. Like Second Thought, he has 1,600 patrons on his Patreon and probably makes a lot of money at this. Curiosity Stream is another one. For just $3 a month, you can access a bunch of documentaries. And yeah, there are a lot of tutorial videos. There are tutorial videos for everything on YouTube, from, doing art, editing video, fixing your car, cooking, and so on and so on. There are a lot of lectures from college professors and intellectuals. So I think in a free market, why couldn't we have more digitized education? And I think this is where, if education is to be fixed, honestly, I think this is how it's going to be done. I think someone, And maybe this won't happen, but I think someone is going to figure out a way, and I think people are already working on this, but people are going to figure out a way to digitize homeschooling by bringing elements of online video lectures and lesson plans, or just lessons, I guess, along with interactive apps like Duolingo. Maybe there are some apps and software that teach people how to read and write and do basic arithmetic. We know that there are Zoom and Skype tutors. I think what's going to happen is someone's going to figure out a way to bring all of these elements together and offer a quality homeschool brand education at a low cost. And I think I've already heard that because of COVID, because more people are looking toward homeschools because the public schools in a lot of places are not opening fast enough. And a lot of families are doing pod learning where families get together. Maybe one parent, maybe 3 different families, one parent volunteers to watch kids throughout the day while everyone else is at work. And I think that's where ultimately this is going to go. And maybe it gets acquired by someone like an Amazon or a Google. We get an Amazon Academy, a Google School, and they offer tuition at, say, $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 a year, way lower than the national average today. And think about what other benefits this provides with growing concerns about education. You have to worry less about bullying, about your kid getting bullied at school. You have to worry less about school shootings. You have to worry less about diseases. You don't have to worry about, driving your kids to school and picking them up. Maybe not as far, at least, if it's all, in the neighborhood. And I think once that happens, if something like that were to ever take off, kind of like what we saw with Uber and Lyft with taxi monopolies and what Airbnb is doing to the service industry, I think you're going to see a greater demand for voucher programs so parents can say, just give me the education money that you're spending on the schools and then I'll just, homeschool my kids. Because public education is a disaster.
Imagine if public schools had the funding for even a handful of art tablets or iPads. Kids could come out of middle school with skills they could translate into a rewarding...
And I would say they do. Again, going back to what I said earlier, if you look at a school district like Detroit Public Schools, if I recall correctly, Detroit Public Schools spend roughly $14,500 per student per year on public education. Imagine if you just had a classroom of 10 students. You have, right off the bat, you have $145,000 per year. You can pay the teacher, say, $70,000, $80,000 per year. And after that, you have $60,000 left over for just 10 kids. You can probably buy them all iPads, all notebooks, all the quality school supplies. If we're to assume that the classroom they're in, it probably costs less than $500 a month to power and heat and plumbing, for water. So what, that would be, if they're in school for 8 months out of the year, that'd be what, $4,000? You'd probably still have thousands of dollars left over after you pay the teacher, after you pay the utilities, and you buy all the supplies. But how come we're not asking those questions? Where is all the money going in all of these schools that are not doing a good job at educating kids? But whatever, it's all capitalism's fault, you guys.
Blow it out your ass.
Career or hobby by the time they graduated from high school or college. Okay, so what are some solutions we could pursue? It's all well and good to say teach better classes, but that only addresses part of the problem. The root cause of many of the issues our education system faces is that we simply don't have an incentive to teach our students. As with anything in America, if there's no financial incentive, nothing will change. The profit motive is the bottom line.
You're goddamn right. I wish we had more of a profit motive in education.
Schools have an incentive to at least prepare students.
Maybe the Jeff Bezos, he's already, he got rich by selling books.
For standardized testing, so that their parents will be happy and keep paying tens of thousands of dollars per year for tuition. But that education comes packaged with truly damaging ideology, so making private schools more accessible would not be a long-term solution, as those students would go on to pass even more ludicrous free market education reforms.
So this is kind of the false dichotomy he's proposing. It's, we either try to figure out how to spend public school dollars better, or else if we just put it in the free market, it would just be a bunch of religious dogma, along with Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman and PragerU. That's the only option you would get. You'd see no competition, nobody offering different approaches.
Vocational schools are an option if we truly believe the only purpose of education should be to prepare students for the job market. There's a lot to be said for picking a trade and excelling in it. Electricians, welders, AC technicians, these are all critical roles in our society. One problem with vocational schools is that they typically come with a tuition, which can be a difficult burden for many families. Homeschooling is another option, though in the US, it often carries a similar connotation to private schools. Many homeschooled children come from very religious backgrounds and are kept separate from other kids their age, which can lead to serious developmental issues. That being said, there are plenty of homeschooling programs that include on-location learning, such as in museums or on community college campuses. This offers a more diverse, hands-on experience for students and can provide an excellent learning environment depending on the child. Now, that right there is something we don't discuss enough in the US. Appropriate education depends on the child. We don't all learn the same way.
See, this is where he gets to. So yeah, let's free up the market and just try to find schools and teachers and tutors who fit your kids' needs the best, rather than letting the government establish a monopoly like it has been for decades.
Some students learn more quickly than others. Some require hands-on experience. Some learn simply by watching or listening. By creating one single standardized educational template, we're trying to standardize a whole spectrum of humanity, and that just doesn't work. There are some types of education, such as those found in Montessori schools, that try to foster a more diverse learning environment, allowing students to learn at different paces and having students who grasp subjects more quickly work with those who are struggling. This allows more room for personal growth, but also fosters empathy and interpersonal skills. The jury is still out on whether Montessori schools are strictly better than more traditional education, but some studies seem to say pretty conclusively that their students fare better than those in standard schools.
And I'm generally in favor of Montessori education, particularly at the elementary level, than the alternatives. But again, maybe if we freed up the market, maybe we would see more Montessori schools, along with religious schools.
Overall, the moral of the story is that, like always, privatization is harming the majority in the pursuit of ever greater profits. The defunding of public schools has caused our country to slip further and further behind
Defunding of schools.
our peer nations. Our inability to keep up with the times has produced students who are woefully under-equipped to compete with students from other countries. Even from a capitalist perspective, it should be clear that our education system isn't working. And maybe that's the point. Maybe for the ruling class, it's desirable for the average American student to fail, so that they're forced to take the lower-paying jobs that generate huge profits.
Oh, it was the ruling class who ruined education, you guys.
Whether that's the case or not, I think it's safe to say that we cannot expect the federal government to solve the problem. For at least the
I agree.
past 40 years, they've been completely controlled by massive corporations, and will continue to trend towards suicidal free market non-solutions. Instead, I would suggest that education on the community level could be a worthwhile endeavor. If we expanded the idea of homeschooling to include other members of your community, we could create localized educational templates that not only allowed for more individualized expression, but also catered towards the needs and
And this is where I agree. See, I'm a fair guy. I know I've trashed this guy for being a Marxist moron, socialist propaganda channel, and he definitely gets a lot wrong. But here I agree. This education, I think, ultimately needs to be solved more at the local grassroots level, because that's how it operates already. It's usually operated at the local level, and I think that's where it needs to be solved. And I would be in favor of this, more homeschooling options and more, being closer to your community and whatnot, I guess. Not in a collectivistic sense, but just because it's more convenient.
unique perspectives of each community. Local experts could teach small classes in their respective fields. Students could learn the history of their town, city, or region. Parents could build a network of trust where they could all help supervise or teach each other's children.
And how do you achieve this when the government takes over school, when the government has control over schools?
Which in turn would strengthen the community, fostering cooperation, friendship, and empathy. These communities could engage in sort of small-scale exchange programs, day or week-long trips where students could experience the realities of different communities, which would provide them with worldly experience and a refreshing change of pace. We tend to get stuck in the notion that what we have now is the only possibility, whether that's in regards to healthcare, entire economic systems, or education. There are so many improvements we could make, so many possibilities worth exploring, and few are more important than how we teach the next generation. More and more often, young people are turning to alternative sources for their education. YouTube is a great one. I've learned a lot just from watching videos on topics I'm interested in.
Yeah, it's almost like YouTube has provided a market for people to create educational videos.